My name is Kenneth, and I've spent a lot, and I mean a lot of time camping, hiking, and fishing. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains of northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful place to camp and has some pretty interesting views to admire. Anyway, it was the middle of October, and I was going hunting with my son, who was 10 at the time, for his first hunting lesson. Growing up, learning how to use guns, I wanted to teach my son the same way. Some might argue that 10 is too young to be learning how to shoot, but he was mature and knew not to touch a gun when I was around. I taught him the basics of firearm use, and he seemed to understand it fairly well. My original plan was to use the deer hunting tower hidden deeper into the woods, but figured it was too advanced for him. Anyway, we're hiking for about 2 hours with plenty of food and water when I spot a large buck about a football field away. I tell my son to get out his .22 and guided him through the steps one last time and went to take the shot. So there he is, aiming his gun at the deer when he fires and misses way off. Just as I was about to say something to him, I notice a man emerging from behind a large tree about 10 feet away. I give him a quick wave and tell my son that we were moving to another spot. As I said this, the man begins to follow behind while still keeping his distance. Let me point out that seeing someone this deep into the woods wasn't common, and this guy wasn't wearing anything that even resembled a hiker or a hunter. Long story short, we kept moving along the trail, watching the autumn leaves begin to fall off the trees and onto the ground. My son then began to ask me as to who that man was, to which I told him I didn't know and to just ignore him. As we were walking, I then hear footsteps crunching in the leaves from behind me. I stop and take a deep breath to compose myself and turn around to see the same man with this unsettling grin across his face. At this point, I could tell that my son was getting a bit freaked out, as was I. In an annoyed tone, I tell him to leave us alone and that we were armed. However, this didn't seem to faze him as he kept standing there with the same grin. As if things couldn't get any worse, I see 4 other men appear from behind trees, all of them wearing masks of some sort. One of them was holding a large axe while the others had bats. At this point, fighting them off was pointless, and so I grabbed my son's arm, running as fast as we could, praying to God that they weren't following us. All the while, I could have sworn I heard rapid footsteps from behind us, but didn't want to look and just focused on running. Within a matter of minutes, we made it to the parking lot with thankfully nobody behind us. My son and I get into the truck and drive off before it got dark. Needless to say, my wife wasn't happy at all, and she refused to let my son go hunting with me anymore. 2 weeks go by, and I'm at the kitchen table drinking coffee while watching the news when I see a chilling news report. The news had talked about unexplained deaths in the same forest that my son and I were at. As the story goes, a couple were camping in those woods about 2 weeks ago when their camp was raided after coming back from a hike. This apparently caused them to become distracted by cleaning up the belongings when someone stabs the wife from behind. Wife dies instantly, and the husband was then knocked out cold, and that's why he was able to tell the story. This same process continued with other locals in the area before the authorities decided to do an investigation. They showed who the suspect was, and when they did, I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. It was the same man we had seen while hunting, and police had found him and arrested him along with 3 other men. I wasn't sure what happened to the other one, but the story went around like crazy and was all over the newspapers for the next month. Till this day, I'm not sure as to what their intentions were or why they confronted us, and I never found out. But if they had weapons, they obviously weren't good. It was profoundly terrifying. When I was about 14, my family and I moved into a new house. It wasn't anything too special, just your standard 1-storied home appropriate for a family of 3. I was home alone one Friday night as my parents were attending a work company event, leaving me to stay home. I couldn't go outside as it was getting dark and the snowfall had just started. Our town was pretty small with about 1,400 people living here, and it was as boring as it could be. With me stuck at home with nothing to do, I came up with the childish idea to prank call random numbers. Being 14, I thought nothing of it and wasn't aware as to how some people would take it. I started off with dialing a few random numbers, hoping to get a funny reaction from people. This process continued for about a good 30 minutes with people not answering or hanging up on me. With no good reactions, I called someone one last time, hoping to get what I wanted, but got anything but that. I dialed a number and they eventually picked up, but before I got the chance to say anything, the person on the other line begins to list personal information about me. My name, address, phone number, my parents' names, and even the school I attended. It was a voice I'd never heard before. It was deep and raspy to the point where it wasn't understandable to an extent. After that, the call hung up and I sat there with terror written all over my face, not believing as to what just happened. My parents wouldn't be home for another 2 hours, so I locked the doors and closed the blinds due to the constant paranoia. Right then and there, I blocked the number and sat in my room while texting my friend. I'm on the phone for about a good 10 minutes when another number is calling me. I was hesitant at first, but I picked it up only to hear the all too familiar voice on the other end. The creepiest thing is, the call came from California. I lived in Indiana. I'm a 22-year-old female, and this happened about a few weeks ago. For some context, I work at my local Starbucks as a barista and would oftentimes have to work super early in the mornings as I had classes during the afternoon and night. This was during the global pandemic, and our state was one of the states that reported a high record of increasing cases. And seeing as fall was rolling in, it was no big surprise. Because of this, our manager obviously made us clean the shop like crazy and made sure we were on top of it. This included wiping down the tables and making sure everyone wore a mask. One morning, a coworker of mine had told me to go clean the outside tables as a few customers had left. I put on my sweater and mask and start spraying the table when I looked to my right and noticed a guy sitting in his car in the parking lot. Now, this wasn't too strange as the Starbucks was located in the city, so you'd have a lot of people everywhere. I go back inside and continue my place at the counter when the guy from the car walks in. At this point, I realized that he was not a pleasant looking man. His eyes were red and his skin was pale, and his hair was a mess. He came right up to the counter, and as usual, I greeted him with a, "Hi, welcome to Starbucks. What can I get for you?" He responds with, "I'll just have a medium black coffee, sweetie." I awkwardly smile and tell him his total. He then proceeds to take out a $5 bill and then gives it to me, making sure our hands touch. I tell him that it would be right out, and he goes to sit at a nearby table. While brewing his coffee, I see him constantly staring at me through the corner of my eye, but I tried to make it seem like I wasn't interested and just focused on working. Once the coffee was done, I bring it over to him and tell him to enjoy while walking back to the counter. "So, Kate, what time do you get off?" At first, I was confused as to how he knew my name, but I then realized that I had my name tag on. I quietly cussed to myself and turned around to face him. I answer him nervously and lie, telling him that I got off at 6, when in reality I got off at 4. He asks me if he could pick me up to give me a ride home, and I politely decline, telling him that I already have a ride. He went from just your average Starbucks customer to just plain rude. Thankfully, he takes his coffee and walks right out the door. I begin to tell my coworker about the guy, and she gets this shocked look on her face and recommends I tell the manager. For some reason, at that point, I didn't end up reporting him to our manager, which, looking back, was a stupid decision. Finally, 4 p.m. comes around and I tell my coworker that I'm leaving. I go outside to my car, making sure the guy was nowhere in sight. Thankfully, he wasn't. Being a paranoid person who watches way too many horror movies, I thought for sure that he would be out here waiting for me. The next day when I come into work, my coworker comes over to me and says, "Kate, is everything okay?" in somewhat of a worried voice. I respond with yes and tell her about the guy from yesterday. What she said next chilled me to the bone. That guy came in the store just before 6. He said he was here to pick you up. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach, and I told her that I lied to him, claiming that I got off at 6, which is why he was here. I then told my manager everything that had happened, and he said that he would keep an eye out for him. The most disturbing part, however, is later that day, my coworker had told me that when he got out of his car, she saw 2 hidden men in the back seat. After that, I quit my job at Starbucks as I didn't feel safe, and I now work at a grocery store. God only knows what would have happened to me had I told him the real time I got off.